Sometimes I feel so sad. Will I ever stop grieving? I can't seem to shake this sense of guilt I always feel when I do something for myself.
Welcome to the Surviving Alzheimer's podcast. I'm your host, Ken Cardita. In this podcast, I'll share the experiences and lessons learned during the 12-year journey down Dementia Road with my wife, Shannon. It is my desire that you'll find joy and peace while learning to live with your loved one's Alzheimer's disease and not let the disease define you or your loved one. The Surviving Alzheimer's podcast is brought to you by Ascending Minds, LLC. In today's episode, we'll talk about some difficult topics, that of grief, guilt, and ambiguous loss. Now, it's not my goal to depress you any further, as I'm sure you've experienced each of these emotions and feelings while you've been on your caregiving journey. But it is my intention that as I reflect upon my experiences and share them with you, that with a little bit of perspective, I can discuss how we as caregivers can experience these often difficult emotions, but not allow them to hold us hostage. At this point in my journey, I've learned that grief can actually be a healthy emotion, as it can help you process your losses. On the other hand, I have found that I have absolutely no use for guilt most of the time, as it usually serves no one. Most likely, I can spend a complete episode on each one of these emotions. But I think for now in today's episode, I will just talk a little bit about each one and how we might be able to deal with them in a somewhat healthy way. I will touch upon how grief has taught me and continues to teach me to appreciate what we've had and to treasure what remains. I will also share how I battled and conquered guilt, especially after when I chose to move my wife to a memory care facility. Finally, I will introduce you to probably one of the most unique dementia caregiving experiences, and that is the one of ambiguous loss. In today's episode, I've titled it, I've Grieved 100 Losses. Although my wife is still very much alive, I have mourned the loss of her hundreds of times. Each time she loses and has lost an ability to do something, I have mourned that loss. At first, it was many small things. And along the way, there came some big ones as well, like being able to have a two-way conversation. It's been a few years since that really has been able to happen. Let's first take a look at what is grief. If you look it up in the dictionary, it tells us that it's a keen mental suffering or distress over affliction or loss. Sharp sorrow, painful regret, cause of keen distress or sorrow. That just about nails it, doesn't it? Grief is a mental or emotional suffering or distress caused by loss or regret. It's especially used to refer to the feeling of sorrow and loss from the death of a loved one. Now, as I have been grieving for what seems like forever, in reality, it's only been about 4 or 5 years. And I suspect that it will continue until sometime after my wife passes. When I think that this grief may never go away, when I'm feeling down, I have to put on the brakes and stop myself. Because experience has taught me that is a one-way trip to depression land. At first, when I would feel these attacks of grief, I would ignore the grief. But I found that as a poor coping mechanism. Because eventually, you'll either go totally emotionally numb, or it will build up and you'll explode and sink into despair and a deep depression. Neither of these options is where you want to be. They were both unhealthy situations. The week I moved Shanna to memory care, I started to see a grief counselor who taught me many good things about dealing with grief, fear, and guilt. We met many times over the course of 9 months. That, combined with my faith and belief system, has enabled me to minimize the grief I feel. These days, I usually know when I'm going to feel some grief. I get triggered by something. It can come in an instant, though, often out of the blue. Like when you're walking in your house and you see a photo on the wall, which triggers a memory, and before you're thinking back to a time before Alzheimer's had a place in your life and you're reminiscing about what happened and how you enjoyed it, and then you feel the loss. I start to feel this sadness start to well up in my chest, and thoughts start to race, and then tears begin to form. I now catch myself and ask these questions. Have I already grieved this loss? Do I need to finish grieving over this thing? Or am I just doing this out of a habit? Now, based on these answers, I'll either come to terms with the fact that grieving this particular item is no longer needed and move on and try to be grateful for the memory, trying to halt the grief. Sometimes I will let the grief out and have a good, healthy cry and try to let all of it out. And I do my best to try and limit this to last just a few minutes, as once I have felt the energy of the grief leave my body and it has been released, then I begin to gain control of my emotions again and try to think and feel my way back to a place of peace. It is truly amazing that the more times you do anything, the better you get at them. And for me, this one has been one of the keys of my surviving Alzheimer's, is that I've been able to, I'll call it, manage my grief in a healthy manner. Now, that's not to say I don't get sad. I get sad just about every day. But what I do is I monitor and I make sure that I don't habitually grieve over the same things. I tried my best to come to terms with each item, and once I feel like I'm at a place of peace, I no longer dwell on grieving over that particular loss. Now let's talk about guilt. Guilt is defined as a feeling of responsibility or remorse for some offense, crime, wrongdoing, whether real or imagined. Let's unpack that a little bit. It is a feeling of responsibility or remorse, which that's the easy part. But the key thing is we've done something wrong. We've committed an offense, crime, or a wrongdoing. I think if you examine much of the guilt a caregiver might feel, there were no wrongdoings or crimes. Yes, there may have been imperfect behaviors, or we may have lost our composure. It's not like you committed a crime. Now, some of the things that I have felt guilty about, maybe you can relate to some of these. Back at the time when I was a full-time caregiver, I often fell short. But I have realized this is mostly about my sense of perfectionism and unrealistic expectations I put on myself. I so much wanted to be the perfect husband, the perfect caregiver. But as we all know, that is impossible. When I would lose my patience and control of my emotions, this guilt that I felt became somewhat of a wake-up call. But if I let it go beyond that, it turned into episodes of self-loathing and beating myself up, and my self-talk was very negative, and it led to other non-productive negative emotions. Yes, it's good to realize where you've fallen short, and guilt can be a wake-up call, but anything further than that, I think, is non-productive. Another time I felt a considerable amount of guilt was when I was coming to grips with the fact that I can no longer continue to be my wife's primary and sole caregiver. I was having feelings of guilt over the fact that I was quote unquote giving up. And that is so against my nature. I'm more like the dog that never lets go of the bone. I never give up. And I really struggled with this for a few months. I was somewhat snapped into reality when, as I was in the very beginning stages of looking for places to relocate my wife to, I suffered a pretty bad incident of getting yet again another kidney stone. Unfortunately, I've had 4 surgeries and over 10 kidney stones in the course of my life, and I know all too well what that can do to someone. So I got hit with a pretty big one, and it had been quite a while. It had been many years since I've had one. And I had to spend the weekend in the hospital and have surgery. Luckily for me, my daughter was in town to celebrate our granddaughter's birthday, and our whole family was gathered together. Unfortunately, I missed the birthday party, but luckily they were able to take care of my wife while I recovered in the hospital. But as I laid in the hospital, I realized that if something bad would happen to me, or if I would continue down that slope of becoming unhealthy and not being able to take care of my wife, what good would I have been? And this pushed me to continue on with finding a place for her to go. Now, I don't think I quite got over this guilt. I was working on it. But again, a month or so later, I actually did find a place and move my wife into memory care. And I'll share with you a little bit of the process of how I chose to go about that. All my life, I've always prayed for guidance, especially on major, big decisions. Every time we moved, every time I was changing jobs, I would pray about it and try and get a feeling of confirmation from God that this would be the right thing for me to do. So when it came to moving Shanna out of our home into memory care, I prayed specifically for 4 things in this order. First question I asked God was, should I? Once I got my answer, it was, where should I move her to? Then once I had located a place that felt right, when should I do it? And then finally, how should I actually do the transition? This process took about 2 weeks. I quickly got the should I answer over a weekend where it was one of the hardest and most difficult caregiving weekends of our experience. The where came pretty quickly, and as did the when and the how. I really struggled with the how. Leading up to the move, there was tremendous anxiety. And I didn't feel too much guilt. But in the days and weeks that followed the move, the guilt came roaring back. I can remember those first couple of weeks I would leave the memory care facility and sit in the car hysterically upset, yelling, "Ken, what have you done? What have you done?" My perspective was totally skewed. Even months later, when things started to get difficult for Shanna and she was not as cooperative with the caregivers as we would like her to have been, I kept questioning again. Each time when the guilt started to rear up again, I remembered those confirmation of those prayers, those answers to prayers. I even went back and reread my journal of that time period where I got those answers and recorded how that felt. As time went on, the durations of these, I'll call them guilt episodes, started to become reduced. And then eventually, the time in between them started to expand. So it was happening less often, and when it happened, it was less intense. Eventually, I was able to catch myself in the act and repeat my mantra of, "Ken, this was the best thing for both of you. God told you so. What more assurance do you need?" And that would get my mind on the right path. Now, there's another type of guilt that I felt. Not as intense. And I guess you would call it survivor's guilt. Now, as Shanna declined, I was still able to do many things that she could no longer do. And I started feeling, wow, I can still enjoy these aspects of my life, and poor Shanna, she can't. I started feeling guilty about that disparity. And Shanna was not always able, as time progressed, to fully appreciate or even tolerate some of our larger family events and milestones. And it finally got to the point where it was just best for her not to attend them. This was particularly hard during the holiday seasons over the last couple of years. We started out as having holidays always at our house with our children and grandchildren gathering, and Shanna would have a good time. And as time went on, the noise was difficult. The overstimulation was causing her a little bit of agitation, and sometimes she would have to retreat to the bedroom and lay in bed and just get away from everything for a while. And her ability to stay with the family would reduce, and there came a time where she could really only endure being with the family for about an hour and a half. And this eventually led to me taking her out of memory care for an hour to visit everyone on Christmas and then return her back. And where we're at now is oftentimes, for the most part, she doesn't attend family celebrations or get-togethers. We still do celebrate her birthday. We all go to her in the memory care center. But just this last month, I had 2 grandchildren graduate from high school. We've had numerous birthday parties. There have been school sporting events and casual get-togethers that I've gone to alone. And I have felt at each one of these a little bit of survivor's guilt. And last year was our first Thanksgiving without her. We made some adjustments. I knew where we were having Thanksgiving was quite far away. And by the time I drove her there, she'd probably only last a half an hour. And my family would have missed out on having both of us there. So what we decided to do was, some of us who were visiting from out of town went and spent the morning with Shanna while she had her Thanksgiving meal in the cafeteria, and we hung out with her. And then we said goodbye, and we gathered as a family about an hour away. And I had a great time. But again, on the drive home, all I can think about is I wish Shanna would have been there. So this survivor's guilt is really difficult. I'm still struggling with it, to be honest. And with the holidays a few months away, I am a little unsettled on how I might feel about that, but I'm going to work on it. What I do now to deal with this is I tell Shanna about the events as they're coming up, and I always promise her I will take videos and I will take some photos. When I come back and see you afterwards, I'll share them with you. And that's what I've been doing. And that seems to be good enough for her. She never complains about missing out. And when I tell her about the occasion, she smiles. And the fact that I know she's not missing out and I'm able to fully enjoy it because I don't have to worry about her at the event, it allows me to be able to power through it. But the sadness still shows up. And I experienced this just this last weekend. I got sad and grieved the fact that she was not able to be at a very special experience with my oldest son. And I had to keep reminding myself that I have to be there for the both of us and to look forward to sharing with her what I can. And that's what I did, and it was good. In summary, I have come to learn that for about 95% of the time, my guilt is imagined and not real, and not really warranted. And it is just an unhealthy and distorted way to interpret things when I do not focus on the facts of the actual situation. Let me give you an example. So using the example of moving her to memory care, what were the facts? I was burnt out. I could not see myself continuing to be a full-time caregiver for the years that she would remain alive. The fact is, I did the best that I could for 4 solid years, even enduring the COVID pandemic and shutdowns and lockdown. Her quality of life was basically non-existent. That I am no less of a husband or advocate or friend or caregiver to my wife. It's just that my focus has changed. Another fact is that we're both happier and healthier. In fact, I have my wife back. She is safe and well cared for. And the bottom line is we have traded quantity of time for quality of time. So there really is no longer a reason to feel guilty about any of this. And it has taken me about 14 months, but I'm glad to be rid of the guilt surrounding moving her to memory care. Now I just have to continue working on my survivor guilt as the holidays come, and I have to figure out how not to allow that to make me feel sad or overly depressed. When I've done something wrong in the past, especially when I was a full-time caregiver, I have to be 100% accountable. And that guilt is real. And I focused on learning from my mistakes, make my amends, apologize, and move on, and learn to try not to continue to beat myself up with additional guilt. This too has been liberating. Let's turn to the final part of our discussion today and talk about something called ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss was a phrase that was coined by a family therapist. Her name was Pauline Boss. She coined this term over 40 years ago. She wrote a book around the year 2000 with that as its title. And I had never heard of this term until just a couple of years ago. I read her book that I would recommend every caregiver to read. It's called Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. She talks a lot about this ambiguous loss and other very helpful things in that book. She created this term to refer to the lack of information and closure that surrounds the loss of a loved one. At its core, ambiguous loss is all about lack of resolution. But Dr. Boss talks about and created two categories to differentiate between physical ambiguous loss and psychological ambiguous loss. Type 1 deals with physical loss, like when you don't know for sure whether someone you love has died or what has happened to them. An example of this would be what parents of a child who's been kidnapped would go through. Type 2 of this is what we as caregivers experience, and it's a type of ambiguous loss that refers to a psychological loss, including a mental or emotional disappearance, like when our loved one's personality has changed so much that they no longer seem like the person that you once knew. Your loved one is physically present, but they've changed so much, whether emotionally and or cognitively. How do we cope with this? There's a couple things that I've learned. I think the first thing is to put a name on what you're going through. I have found that just being able to put a label on it, on what your experience is, ambiguous loss of losing the person I love the most, it can get you on the path to healing. The next key step is to work towards acceptance. Now, acceptance is not the same thing as closure. But in the absence of the ability to get that closure, it's an important step that helps you to make peace with your new reality, that the things will never be the same with you and your loved one. Another thing to help you deal with this is reaching out for support. Support groups, coaches, people who have been through the similar experience can be very helpful to you. Right after I moved my wife about 18 months ago out to memory care, I was seeing the grief counselor, but then I also joined a support group called Men Who Care, who meet once a month, and it is all men who are caring for a loved one with dementia. The majority are husbands who care for their wives, but there's a few others who are caring for their moms and other people that they love. I can't begin to tell you how the experiences that we've shared in these monthly meetings, there is a special bond that has grown between us as we comfort each other and also share our experiences and potential solutions for the challenges. It has been very helpful. In fact, it has been something that has led me to want to do things like this podcast. Another thing that we can do to help deal with our ambiguous loss is to look for, I'll call it the silver lining or the positive in your situation. I will share a couple of ones that I have discovered along the way. Looking back over the last 6 or so years, I have changed considerably. I have learned to love in ways I never knew existed. I have seen and recognized more of the tender mercies of God in my life as He puts people in our path and blesses us with things that I didn't even know I needed. I've also found that I can now be at peace knowing that my wife is in a safe environment, that she's well cared for and loved by those who live with her and who take care of her. Another thing we can do is to get involved in a good cause. A couple of the things that I've done is I've adopted my new second family at the memory care facilities that my wife is at. Every time I visit, I socialize with all the residents, all the caregivers, know them all by name, and over time get to know their story. I love trying to make the residents smile by either saying something funny to them or just acknowledging that they're there and letting them know that I care about them. And it doesn't hurt to slip them a piece of chocolate or a piece of fruit every now and again. That usually will bring a smile as well. As I said a few minutes ago, helping others with this podcast and my coaching practice of working with families and people who are going through the caregiving stress is my way of paying back people who have helped me. But in reality, as I have helped others, it has helped me to heal as well. Lastly, be kind to yourself. Give yourself grace as you work through your ambiguous loss. Today, we touched upon a couple of very important emotional experiences that most, if not all, caregivers will go through. As I have learned a lot about these feelings and how to work my way through them, I still know I have much more work to do and more experiences to go through. I know that no matter what I do, I will never be totally prepared when my wife graduates from this life. I know that my faith and belief that families are forever, that our separation will be temporary, that will give me the strength to endure her passing. I also know that we will be together again after I die, and she will be made whole in the resurrection and no longer have the limitations of this disease. Sometimes I imagine and wonder what it's going to be like when we're both resurrected and we look back and we discuss the last years of her life, and I finally get to know what her perspective on it is. I'm sure I will learn a lot from that. I hope that my perspective and experience in dealing with these difficult emotions has enabled you to see things in a way that you'll be able to endure and work through your own emotions as you encounter them on your journey on Dementia Road. Once again, I'd like to request, please leave a comment on the Surviving Alzheimer's Podcast Facebook page and let me know your thoughts on today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Next week's episode, I'll return to our backstory. I will share some experiences that happened after her diagnosis and while we were in the process of me becoming a full-time caregiver at home. Until then, remember to take care of yourself so that you can be the best caregiver and support to your loved one. And have a great day. Thanks for watching an episode of the Surviving Alzheimer's Podcast. If you're new to this podcast, I recommend watching episodes 1 through 13 in order so that you can learn our backstory. This will make understanding later episodes much easier. To help you with this, you'll find a link to a playlist called the Surviving Alzheimer's Podcast by episode order in the video description and on the Surviving Alzheimer's YouTube channel. The mission of the Surviving Alzheimer's podcast is to educate and inspire caregivers, family, and friends who are on their own unique journey down dementia road with their loved ones. I would really appreciate it if you could share this episode to anyone who you feel would benefit from it. Additional ways for you to help us reach others are to hit the like button for this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to be notified of new episodes. All of these actions will encourage the YouTube algorithm to share this episode and podcast to other potential viewers.